Hello, and welcome to the Heathen Trans Girl podcast with me, your host, Kaya Fox. Today, I have an episode for you that I am very excited about. It is an absolutely fabulous chamber burial of someone who was quite possibly a warrior and quite possibly a woman. There are definitely some nuances. The excavation and recent studies have brought forth a ton of questions. I've actually written about an 8-page paper on the whole topic that I'm going to be referencing and reading from throughout the episode. I will try to take little breaks, explain it further, make it a little more fun because there's a lot of details in the episode. But I hope you will find it as fascinating as I do, and hopefully this exploration can help you to think outside the box a little bit about some of the assumptions that we draw on excavations and burials that we've uncovered, assuming things about gender and different gendered roles in the Norse Viking Age. Starting with a little quote from chapter 24 of Volsunga Saga. Brynhild answered, "It is not fated that we should abide together. I am a shield maiden, and wear helm on head, even as the kings of war, and them full oft I help. Neither is the battle become loathsome to me." So to start with, I have a little summary of everything that we're going to be talking about in this episode, from the original excavation up to current debates around the topic. So I'm going to read through that first to orient the listener, and then we will go ahead and break it down in a little more detail. So in 1878, archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpa noticed some 3,000 burial mounds on the island of Björkö in the southeast of Sweden, and began meticulous excavations of over 1,000 of those mounds. Among them, situated at the top of a hill overlooking the town and the water, next to a fort and a garrison, he uncovered a remarkable grave. In this chamber grave, he found a well-preserved set of bones, along with a vast array of weapons, strategic gaming pieces, and horses. This grave, BJ581, would come to be known as an example of the quintessential Viking Age warrior. Almost 100 years after BJ581's discovery, an osteologist determined that the bones were of a female sex. This determination was so controversial that in 2017, a necessary genomic test was completed, and the final finding revealed the lack of a Y chromosome and thus a female biological sex. The article detailing the findings of the test was so widely circulated that BJ581 gained a pop culture status. Many news articles and personal opinion pieces extrapolated generalities about warrior women and Viking Age society, while others critiqued the findings from every angle. In 2019, a follow-up article was published by the original researchers to combat some of this and reaffirm the integrity of their findings. In this episode, we'll explore the original excavation site, examine the grave goods, and discuss the questions of gender that a 10th century biologically female person found with weapons raises. As someone within the queer community, specifically the transgender community, I am well aware of the distinction between biological sex and gender. But for those who are not, very quickly, biological sex is typically seen as a binary option between male and female of genomes, DNA, bones at birth, where gender is a social construct, a societal role. Now, neither gender or sex are as simple as that. There are entire academic fields of queer study, but Just very briefly, that is the distinction between sex and gender. And for the sake of this podcast episode, I will be using gender neutral pronouns for the person found in the grave of BJ581 until we get a little further on into discussions of gender. Starting at the beginning, the find, 1878. Birka, currently known as Sweden's first town, was an urban settlement built around 750 CE on the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. It hosted a population of 700 to 1,000 people for approximately 200 years until the mid-900s, and was used as a center of trade and commerce for the wide-traveling people. Now, the Viking Age, spanning from 750 to 1050, includes all of Birka's existence within it. In 1871, entomologist and archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe came to the island of Björkö, seeking to find prehistoric insects fossilized in amber. Noticing the 3,000 burial mounds on Björkö, he became intrigued in the human remains and began his excavations of over 1,000 graves. In 1878, at grave number 581, his team found 2 horses buried near an 8-foot wide granite boulder. Now, horses usually indicated a particularly significant grave, so they set to work removing the boulder via dynamite. Below it, in the words of Stolpe in his report to the Royal Academy, was, quote, perhaps the most remarkable of all the graves in this field. Okay, so we've got this guy, Hjalmar Stolpe, in the late 1800s, who comes to the island of Björkö looking for insects fossilized in amber. He gets absolutely fascinated with these 3,000 mounds, a lot of them with big boulders on top of them, and starts excavating the remains of all these burials. About halfway through, he comes across possibly the most remarkable of all of them, dynamites the boulder to get down to it, and finds all these fascinating things. So on to the chamber and the goods. Beneath the boulder was a large wood-lined chamber, or chamber grave, approximately 11 feet by 4 feet, or 3.5 meters by 1.25 meters. It was also deep enough to sit up in. Now, the horses which were found first were at the foot end of the chamber on like a slightly raised shelf. In the main chamber, there was a single set of human bones and a vast array of different artifacts. Based on the construction of the chamber and the position of the bones, it is assumed that the person was buried sitting down, perhaps on their saddle. They would have then faced their horses and looked out to the east over the harbor and the whole town. Birka was a very busy trading town. Lake Mälaren, the lake that Björkö is in, isn't like a landlocked lake. It has access to the open waterways. And it seems like there's evidence of trading along the eastern route. And so things coming from present-day Ukraine and Russia making their way to Birka. So anyway, BJ581 has a great view. Now let's take a look at some of the artifacts. In front of the body, between them and the horses, there was a shield, a comb, and stirrups for riding. Behind the body, there was another shield. To the right of the body, there was a spear, a bronze bowl, a long seax knife, an axe head, and 25 arrows, some of which were of the armor-piercing variety. To the left of the body was another spear, a short knife, and a sword. Additionally, there were horse crampons for riding a horse over ice, a whetstone, trader's weights, and a piece of a silver coin. And lastly, besides clothing, there was a gaming board positioned close to the right side of the body and a full set of gaming pieces positioned as if held in the person's lap upon burial. The full Nafatafel gaming set in the lap and the board nearby are noteworthy because they suggest some form of military command or strategic planning. Often in other burials, these gaming sets and pieces were placed with the bodies of kings, leaders, and strategists. This game was probably nothing at all like chess, but you can imagine it somewhat like chess in that there is like a flat, square-ish gaming board, a king piece, and then I guess you could consider them like pawn pieces, but it was both a pastime and a way to work on learning strategy. Some people think it was played with like one person playing the offense and one person playing the defense. Again, we really have no idea, but there are multiple references in sagas and in the lore to this game. Okay, now back to the weapons. The style of the sword is interesting because it's a style that was uncommon to Norway and Sweden, but more often found along the eastern raiding and trading routes in what would be current day Russia and Ukraine. The long knife, or seax, is also of a type more common to the eastern way. There was no bow found along with the arrows, but there was definitely like a space where it seemed like a bow could have been positioned. I think it's logical that the bow and arrows would have gone together. And as far as I can tell, the arrowheads were of various types, but a decent handful of them were designed specifically to pierce through armor and chainmail. So these were war weapons, not hunting weapons. Moving now to the remnants of clothing, we see even more ties to the east. Above BJ581's head were found 4 small, plum-shaped tassels of silver thread and foil. These would have possibly hung from ribbons on a hat and have been filled with organic material. A 5th item was found near the head, a pointed cone made of silver foil, decorated with tiny beads of silver in a geometric chevron pattern. Silk was found inside the cone, indicating the whole headpiece could have been made of silk. Headdresses like this were unusual in Sweden at the time. Based on other findings, it is likely that it was made in Ukraine. To quote the aforementioned researcher's 2019 article, the tasseled cap in particular is unusual. It was possibly manufactured in Kiev and, according to Ingmar Janssen, was made of a type for the leading members of society. The individual's clothing has also been analyzed, with Birka's leading textile specialist arguing, based on a broad range of comparative data, that the person in BJ581 was a cavalry commander under the immediate authority of a royal war leader. End quote. So we have a very fancy hat, possibly made in Ukraine, possibly being connected to the leading of the cavalry. So silk hat, baubles on the end, fancy silver cone on the top, probably looks very nice. Possibly was used to lead people in on horseback in battle. And that is pretty much it for the chamber grave and the goods themselves. We will get back to the bones later, but I wanted to take a minute to orient again with some of BJ581's neighboring burials and some of the location as to like where specifically they were buried. Because I think all of that helps to give some context to the person in BJ581 as well as the artifacts that they were found with. Looking up now from the grave and its goods, we turn our attention to the immediate surroundings. There were 3 other grave mounds nearby to BJ581 on top of the hill. 2 of them, BJ495 and 496, were chamber graves with weapons, one of which had a horse. The third, BJ608, was a child's grave with no goods included. Regarding the frequency of weapons in Burka burials, only 75 of the 1,100 excavated graves have 1 or more weapons. So that is not a very big ratio, 75 to 1,100. And we have 3 of these burials with weapons, all located next to each other, as well as another child burial with no goods associated next to them. I'm recalling now that there was also, what would that be, a 5th? So 4 others. There was a 5th burial still in the same area, I think slightly further away, and that one has been, so a person was found there with jewelry and brooches. It has been identified as a high status woman's burial. But if I'm remembering correctly, that was just based on the grave goods, not any osteology investigation or genomic testing. Okay, zooming out a little bit more, we get, okay, so zooming out a little bit more now, we see that this small cluster of graves was situated at the top of a hill. It was overlooking the entire town and the harbor, and this cluster of graves was next to 2 very important buildings. One of them was a hill fortress, and the second one has been modernly termed the garrison. And this one is, oh, it's so good, so interesting. So in the garrison, archaeologists found remains of shields, spears, swords, and armor. But even more interesting, 300 knives were built into the walls of the garrison itself, and the floor of the hall was built on a deposit of spearheads. And this is a 20-meter long hall that is currently thought to have housed the warriors of the area. And this hall was burned down, probably in an attack sometime around 965 to 985. For context, the burial of BJ581 has been dated between 913 and 980. And down the hillside, people have uncovered a large number of arrowheads, indicating the possibility of some sort of a battle, perhaps many battles, many raids, parties attempting to come up the hill to the garrison and the fortress. So it is possible that BJ581 died shortly before a raid struck the trading town of Birka, fought its way up the hill to the fort, and burned the garrison. And shortly after, the town collapsed. BJ581 could have also died in a raid or a battle that ended up being unsuccessful. She was buried. Later, the town was abandoned due to another Christian town opening. I don't know why I want to say opening up nearby, like it's a business or something. But another town being established nearby. And then as the conversion to Christianity was happening, the people left Birka, moved to this other town. And then some people came in and burned the garrison. The events are all pretty close to the mid 900s. So a lot of this could have happened within a single lifetime of each other. All right, we have made it 20 minutes in. Let's take a breath for a second, take a sip of coffee or something, because this is where the story kind of takes a natural break. People are astounded with this grave. It appears in many books. It's so rich with grave goods. All the artifacts themselves are fascinating. And almost 100 years goes by before something else happens that begins to change the game and bring this grave back into the popular culture's lens. Given the location beside the hill fort and the garrison, the proximity to other weapon burials, and the extraordinarily complete set of weapons in the chamber of BJ581, it was assumed that BJ581 was male. This assumption came from the general practice of categorizing any grave with weapons as male, and any grave with jewelry and brooches as female. No jewelry or brooches were found in the grave, and so for years to come, BJ581 would be written about as an archetypal elite male warrior grave. Not until 1975, almost 100 years later, did this come into question when a woman looked at these bones. A quick note on sexing by metal. In the time since 1837, when sexing by metal was standard practice, graves with any weapons, even those with no bones at all, were categorized as male. The 30-some graves with weapons beside slender, feminine-looking bones were ignored as noise data. These seem to indicate a clear confirmation bias on behalf of those seeking to discover a masculine Viking age. Quote, "It is important to remember that when BJ581 was recorded, male biological sex was not only conflated with a man's gender identity, but also that warriorhood was presumed to be an exclusively masculine pursuit. The same interpretation would undoubtedly have been made had no human bone survived at all." End quote, 2019 article. Back to the bones. Going back to the chamber grave for a moment, let's follow the bones. Stolpa meticulously marked the placement of everything in the grave on graph paper, noted that there was only one body, and marked every individual bone with BJ581 in India ink. The bones, though too degraded to show any signs of combat, were surprisingly complete for the Birka area, in which many of the other graves left only teeth. The skull, full spine, lower jaw, 2 ribs, bones from each arm and leg, and portions of the pelvis were preserved. The relatively complete nature of the skeleton and detailed documentation by Stolpa made it possible for later researchers to determine additional facts about the body. The level of wear on the molars indicated that BJ581 was at least 30 and as old as 40 years old when they died. Later analysis of strontium in the teeth revealed that they were born somewhere in the western part of the Viking world and didn't arrive in Birka until age 16. All right, now some women start to make some waves. In 1975, osteologist Berit Wilkins was tasked with cataloging and rebuilding the bones of over 100 graves, including BJ581. She noticed that BJ581 was over 5 foot 5 inches, slightly taller than the average male of the time, with the average female sizing in at 5 foot 2. Upon examining the slender forearm bones and pelvis, however, she concluded that BJ581 was biologically female. Lacking the misplaced skull which could have supported her determination, and in light of the pervasive technique of sexing by metal, BJ581 remained male. In 2016, another osteologist re-examined Wilkins' findings and concluded the same thing, announcing such at a conference and causing a stir. Quote, "A genomic confirmation of the biological sex of the individual was considered necessary to solve the issue." 2017 article. In 2017, a team of researchers at Uppsala University and Stockholm University, headed by Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson, conducted a genomic DNA test in search of a Y chromosome in the DNA of BJ581. If the Y chromosome were found, BJ581 would be determined male. If the Y chromosome were not found, and only X, however, BJ581 would be determined female. Quote, "The genomic results revealed the lack of a Y chromosome and thus a female biological sex." End quote, 2017 article. From 2017 forward, BJ581 would never be determined male again. In the storm of opinions following the publication of their research, questions and criticisms came to light, which were eventually addressed in a follow-up article by the same team in 2019. The root of most of the objections seems to come from a twofold belief: that biologically female means woman, and that women in the Viking Age couldn't possibly be warriors. We will address the more nuanced topic of sex and gender shortly, but first let's focus on the believed impossibility of a woman being a warrior. Due to people's need for BJ581 to remain male, ideas circulated that perhaps there had been two bodies in the grave, or that the bones had gotten mixed up over time in storage. Recalling now Stolpa's use of pioneering recording methods, labeling end graphs. This, along with the genomic testing being done on multiple bones, helps to counter, quote, "the objections that were immediately raised as to whether we had analyzed the correct skeleton and whether there had been a second body in the grave. The simple and secure conclusion is that we have the right individual who was buried alone, and that this person has been proven to be biologically female." End quote, 2019. So in order for some people to support their ideas that BJ581 had to remain male, they argued that the bones must have gotten mixed up somewhere during the storage process, or that it had been a double burial, like a husband and wife, for example, and that the bones of the, quote, husband like had disappeared or something like that. But Stolpa was very meticulous in all the notes and labeled every individual bone. And in the genomic testing, they even tested multiple bones, and they all came back with the same lack of Y chromosome. So the researchers tested the right bones. There was only one body in the grave, and that body is absolutely biologically female. Now, another objection raised was that the artifacts didn't mean that BJ581 was a warrior. Suggestions included that they were a ceremonial warrior, a leader who didn't fight, or even a slave buried with their master's artifacts in place of his absent body, possibly even a wife with marital gifts. The researchers and authors of the article agree that yes, we should be very cautious in making assumptions about the association between a buried body and the grave goods that they're buried with. And then they go on to basically explain the point of Occam's razor. Like, if all these things are pointing to this, like, what is the most simple and logical conclusion that we can come to? Quote, the person in BJ581 was buried in a grave full of functional weapons and war gear and little else in close proximity to other burials with weapons next to a building saturated with weapons outside the gate of a fortress. Furthermore, the interment took place at a time when the hill fort and garrison were at their zenith. Many other interpretations of both funerary treatment and gender are possible, but Occam's razor would suggest that to reach for them as a first resort is an attempt to explain away what seems to be the most obvious and logical conclusion. In our opinion, BJ581 was the grave of a woman who lived as a professional warrior and was buried in a martial environment as an individual of rank. End quote, 2019. Okay, so stepping away from my computer for a moment, let's talk about the distinction between sex and gender and the possibility of a transgender reading in BJ581. I don't know if anyone has heard the silly argument that in 1,000 years, if someone digs up your bones, they're going to look at them and say, this was a boy and this was a girl. It's a silly argument from people who are unaware of the distinction between sex and gender, or who are unwilling to recognize the validity of gender identity. The team of researchers in these articles did an absolutely phenomenal job of separating sex from gender. Yes, they use Occam's razor to go for a simple answer, but they do make that clear distinction. And so I found that very encouraging, that people, not only in the future, but presently, are willing and able to make the distinction between sex and gender in making determinations about historical persons. I would highly recommend that anyone go and read the 2019 article. The team of researchers there does a fabulous job in addressing the transgendered reading as kind of like a distinct possibility, but also making the distinction that transgender, as we perceive it now, is rooted in our current social understanding of gendered roles. And historically, in the Norse Viking Age, specifically the time in which BJ581 was buried, those societal roles and even the concepts of gender as we see them now could have looked completely different. What we would imagine as transgender or even gender fluid or non-binary could have looked very different. Like those possibilities may have existed, but through different lenses in a different way based on the social and societal roles and concepts of gender in that day. As a final quote from the article, this is not, and for practical reasons, cannot be an attempt to achieve a greater understanding of Viking Age sex and gender systems in their totality. Instead, this is a case study that, in some ways, presents more questions than answers, but which opens up previously unexpected possibilities. End quote. To reiterate, Charlotte Hedenstjerne Jansen and her team have successfully and finally determined that BJ581 is biologically female. Using the logical device of Occam's razor, they came to the opinion that BJ581 was a woman and a warrior of rank. Saxo Grammaticus, in his Gasta Danorum, written in the 13th century, albeit biased, writes, "There were once women among the Danes who dressed themselves to look like men and devoted almost every instance of their lives to the pursuit of war, that they might not suffer their valor to be unstrung or dulled by the infection of luxury, for they abhorred all dainty living, and used to harden their minds and bodies with toil and endurance." In her book, The Real Valkyrie, Nancy Marie Brown counts, quote, 20 warrior women from sagas and histories, another 53 in poems and myths. The Icelandic law books, dated 1260 to 1280, consider women with weapons a threat to society, which implies they existed. Depending how my research goes, the next episode is either going to be about warrior women or Valkyries as found in the sagas, histories, and Eddas. I am very excited to do more of this research and present some of it to you. A big thank you for sticking around for this whole episode. If you liked the show, go ahead and give it a rating on Spotify. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has inspired you to do some of your own digging and maybe raised questions that get your gears turning, get your mind chewing on some things. So thank you very much. Have an amazing rest of your day, and I will see everyone soon. Bye. Sources for this episode are the 2017 and 2019 article by the team of researchers headed by Charlotte Hedenstjerne Jansen, as well as Nancy Marie Brown's The Real Valkyrie and Kat Jarman's River Vikings.